Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Hi, Davida.
Hello, Happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you. You too. Here. Okay. Um, can we get an approval of the minutes from last meeting?
Make the motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Probably moved and seconded. Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Yes.
I need to abstain. I need to abstain.
Okay. Um, okay. You're just a minute premature. From
Didn't you see the minutes?
Yes.
yes.
Yeah, the first and the second. He didn't call the roll yet, so he's going to call the roll.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So, hearing no unreadiness on the motion, want to call the roll? Do you want to call the roll on the minutes?
Call approval of the minutes.
Each of the individual commissioners.
Judge Adrian,
Aye.
Downing.
I wasn't at the meeting. So
Okay.
those of us who weren't there are going to have to abstain.
Okay.
I guess I should abstain too because I don't think I was there either.
Okay.
Yeah.
Downing.
So,
Minutes then to the next meeting.
kind of looks like that's going to be the case.
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll hold it to the next meeting.
Very good. My error. Okay, the next item of business today would be to review the evaluation approach that we're going to take to dealing with those items that have been brought before us for consideration and the criteria that we want to use in order to do that evaluation. And we had looked at criteria before, and we had come up with several things that we thought we should utilize in order to evaluate those things that are placed in front of us this time. And the first amongst those was to determine whether or not the items that are in front of us this time have already been evaluated before, because what we had concluded was that if they have been evaluated before, and unless there is some really striking new information that someone is putting in front of us, that those items are already on the table if they were passed on to council previously, or if they were not passed on to council previously and the last charter commission had determined that for whatever reason they weren't appropriate, unless something new has come up, there's no reason for us, to dig into them again. The second was whether or not there's any other new information or conditions that have arisen since the last time for prior recommendations. The third item was to see whether or not the presentations that are made to us this time around are for the purpose of clarifying language or purpose of some portion of the charter. And if that's the case, then those would things would be things that would be appropriate for us to review. The next one, I think, is kind of an interesting piece, and I think we talked about it before, as it relates to whether the item that's being proposed is something that's appropriate for inclusion in a fundamental document like the county charter. It might be a perfectly good, recommendation, but it may not be something that belongs in the county charter. So we need to kind of evaluate things about to determine whether or not they're appropriate in that way. The fifth one was, does the recommendation or the request contribute to government accountability, government effectiveness, or government efficiency? So if it meets all the other criteria we were talking about, and we get down to that, it's still a question as to whether or not it's something that will move the dial forward by putting it in the charter. And then lastly, the question would be whether or not the proposal enhances the powers or presents new opportunities for the county government that are not currently contained in the charter, and therefore would be things that we will want to put in because it's something new that does something that maybe was not thought about at the time the charter was adopted or at the time the last commissions took the matters up. So wanted to kind of see whether or not those items are still the things that we think are the appropriate criteria, whether or not anybody's had some additional thoughts about these matters and things that we either need to add something or whether it's something that we talked about, including the last time, after some additional thought is not appropriate and we want to take it out. So I want to open the floor to determine if either one of those two things are on anybody's mind. Okay, hearing nothing, I'm going to take a silence as assent to what we've got in front of us, and we can move forward. The next item of business would be to kind of review the proposals that have come in and to rank them by priority and using the agreed upon evaluation approach to those. So we had a total 7, 9. 6, 7, yeah. This last week has been kind of a whirlwind for me. So, yeah, so there are 10, excuse me. So we have 10 items. I talked to Janae, and I thought that maybe as we were looking at this, that we could look at each one of these, and we can try to get through as many as possible today, to see if there are some things maybe that after you've looked at them, or if you've looked at them up before now, that you think are clearly not things that we should take out, at which point we can put them over on the side, lay them on the table for the time being, and we can focus on the ones that we think are most appropriate for us to actually put some time and effort into. And then after we've gone through and we've evaluated them using the criteria that we've just agreed previously,
Minutes packet are the ones that were public, and then I'm passing out the ones from the organizations now just to make sure everyone has.
okay.
Mr. Chairman, we're just trying to find the first one. It's with the November minutes, I guess. So, the Inspector General.
Okay.
It's from the League of Women Voters. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Did you find it? Okay, good, because I haven't yet. Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
as a sort of preliminary matter, I know that we've we have 10 proposals in front of us from 10 different stakeholders. It seems like there are at least a couple of them that are overlapping, and in reality, I don't think this commission's going to be making more than one recommendation per topic. You know, likely we'll take into consideration the various input we've received. So I'm guessing, or I'm asking, does it make sense to consider, for instance, the Inspector General amendments together in determining whether or not we want to proceed on the issue generally?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Does anybody disagree with that way of proceeding? So let's take a quick look at the 10 and see which ones kind of lend themselves to being conjoined. So topic 1 and 3, right? Is there any other?
Yeah, actually, even 4, 5, and 6, because Article 9 is governs the PRC.
4, 5, 6. And did you say 9?
No, 4, 5, and 6, and then I don't know, 1 and 3.
1 and 3 we got.
And I don't know if we would consider topics maybe 2 and 7 together. They're slightly different. One deals with nonpartisan and one deals with open primaries. They're slightly different, but they're similar in terms of proposal. Yeah.
Make sure your mics are on.
I'm just saying, my opinion is 2 and 7 should probably be still treated separately because they really are 2 different issues.
Fair
Unless
enough.
somebody has some other thought.
Can we talk about that for a second? You know, because on the one hand, I see exactly what you're saying, but for purposes of what we're going to have to do, does it make sense to treat them together as part of one topic dealing with elections?
So treat it as a topic, but still discuss the differences. Yeah, sure. We
Sure.
can. That's a way. I see what you're saying. Then, yeah, sure.
Because I'm trying to be mindful that there's only a few of us, and I'm trying not to make the work any harder than it has to be. So for the time being, and until we determine that it's not appropriate, let's talk about 2 and 7, at least initially, as being in the same pool. So
Number 9,
Oh.
I don't know how they put that together.
9 and
Yeah, children of offenders, and then campaign finance. There's no relationship
yeah.
there.
Okay, so actually, instead of there being 10 things, we're actually looking at 11.
Correct.
Okay. So as combined, we're looking at 1 and 3, 7 and 2, 4, 5, and 6. And then separating out a new topic 11 from 9. I don't know how we got it together like that either. Is that acceptable? Okay.
Appears to be.
On the surface of it. Okay. Okay. So I don't know how much how much time anyone has spent actually looking at the things other than to read them over. Does anybody have any strong opinions about items that we have just consolidated, one way or other? Davida? Okay. I just want to remember that you're there. Okay. Okay, so if we go back then and we start with 1 and 3 as the first topics of discussion. That's the Office of Inspector General. And the information that came forward from the League of Women Voters really indicated that they thought that the Inspector General's office should be a mandatory on behalf of that office being appointed, and currently it's permissive. And they also wanted to stagger the term. Wanted to guarantee its funding. And make sure that it was separate. This is an item that I think we ought to be taking a deep dive into. Is there anybody who disagrees with that? No?
Judge, what about, I think, Michael, you've been on this commission before. What's your thought process? Because I keep reading evaluations by prior commissions. What do you know about this?
Sure. So the last Charter Review Commission made a recommendation to incorporate the Agency of Inspector General in the charter. It was actually pretty detailed, the level to which they spelled out the authority and the independence of the agency. At the time, council wanted to give the office a little more time to mature. At the time, it was only, I think, a year and a half or maybe a little over 2 years old, and so declined to place the item on the ballot, particularly given the other issues that were deemed important at that time. But there was interest expressed by a number of council members to revisit this issue at a future point in time. And I think the primary interest here is currently the agency only exists by the existence of council ordinance. So hypothetically, it could be abolished tomorrow if council decided they wanted to do that. And memorializing it in the charter gives it a little bit more permanence and could sort of lay some foundational roles for the agency. So I think it's warranted to at the very least revisit the issue and discuss whether or not this commission wants to make a recommendation.
But will the public understand it should the council agree to put it on the ballot?
I believe so. If it's I don't know if I would recommend being quite as prescriptive as the last Charter Review Commission was. I think there's sort of some foundational things to maybe put in there to make sure that it's independent, that it receives adequate resources and funding and things like that. But to the degree that it's in terms of spelling out how interims are to be appointed or how the Inspector General may be removed from office, some of those things you can maybe leave to ordinance, but that's maybe something we can dive a little deeper into as we move forward.
Are we, Judge, able to ask the law director, Mr. Triazzi, what he thinks, or is that not?
Sure. The reason why I put this in the kind of format that we had here was in order to try to identify which ones of the criteria that we were talking about needed to actually have something further placed in front of us, and I figured that was a staff function. So, I mean, if we look at it, and I'm glad you asked the question, because what that basically does for us is says, okay, this has been here before. You know, is there new information out there that we need to be taking a look at? Is there any clarity of the old proposal?
Right.
You know, that now causes us to say that, you know, if we clean up the language or we do anything else with it, you know, it's likely to pass muster with the council. Because I think that at one time or another, one of the things that we need to do is to have our eye cocked over our shoulder to determine whether whatever we're going to put in front of council is actually going to get placed on the ballot. Because if not, then this is a whole lot of spinning of wheels.
I agree.
Okay.
The one thing I would say to that is and I don't want to speak for council from 2013, but it seemed at that time that their reluctance to place it on the ballot was more, they wanted to see how things played out operationally. And I think since then we've had a pretty smooth, the new inspector general came in early 2015. I think by all accounts he's done a good job. And so I think it's really about, they were waiting to see whether or not the office functioned and provided value to the county in its current format before memorializing it, more than taking issue with particular language that was recommended by the commission.
It's functioning properly today?
In my opinion, it is. I'm sure if we
Who
wanted
can
to get
answer that?
some testimony.
Because if it's functioning properly, I don't see any reason we need to fix it.
Well, the one fix that, and that goes again to what is our role. The one fix that they're talking about at the top of the mark is taking it from permissive to being mandatory, that it exists. As it relates to the rest of the things that are in this proposal that talk to, you know, the staggering of terms and dedicated funding and, you know, the rest of that, the question is, you know, is that something that should be in the charter, first of all? And if it is something that should be in the charter, is it something that we should propose? Yes.
So I guess I thought today we were just going through to see if each of these items fulfill the criteria to say, yes, we'll dive into this. Because I'm a little reluctant to say, hey, why change anything? Because to me, I don't have enough information to draw upon that if this is something that should be changed or not. So, and I just want to clarify. So today we're just agreeing, hey, out of these 10 or 11 items now, these are the 5 or 6, or whatever number, we're going to delve into deeper.
Yes.
Correct?
That was
okay.
the point.
Okay.
That was the
I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, and thank you for pulling me back on track.
And Mr. Chairman, I think this is an item that we should look at again as a charter commission and, you know, get more information and have more deliberations on.
Okay.
I think it's timely and it's responsive to our constituents.
If there are, you know, stakeholders, including the inspector general himself, the commission may want to ask to come in and testify so that the commission has more information about how things have been operating. I think that's entirely appropriate.
And how long has it been operating?
The agency itself was, I believe, created in either late 2011 or early 2012. So it's been operating since then. We had our first inspector general was Naila Bird, who's now clerk of courts, and the new inspector general, Mark Griffin, was appointed in 2015 and has been serving since then.
Okay. So, yes.
And then would it be possible to get the, whatever language you put before the council before, would we be able to receive that
Yeah, so-
prior to our next meeting so that we can read ahead if
Absolutely.
this is one of the topics we're going to discuss? Which obviously, if it stimulated this much discussion, just talking about criteria, it seems like this will be one of the topics we would be reviewing further.
Absolutely.
It would seem to me that this would be appropriate to refer to the law department to have them present to us the language from the last review, and also to have them give a read on the rest of the criteria that we're talking about, since this was something was presented previously. See if there's anything else that
Judge, I'd agree with that.
okay. Can we do that by consensus? We need to take a vote.
I think we're all agreed.
Okay. Then we'll move it by consensus then. So that's topics 1 and 3. 7 and 2 are nonpartisan elections and open primaries. And as we point out, those are two different kinds of things, but they both have to do with the election process. Were either one of those presented previously?
Mr. Chair, I believe the concept of nonpartisan elections was presented to the prior Charter Review Commission. I don't recall off the top of my head whether a proposal was recommended to council, but I do believe it was one of the issues they encountered.
Okay. And so at present, we don't know whether or not there's any new information in this proposal that was not presented the last time.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Not to your knowledge, whether or not there is, or
Whether or not there is. It is on their list of topics they considered, but I don't believe it was in their recommended, one of their recommended changes at that time.
Okay. And it never got to the point of making a ballot.
No, I do believe council did consider the topic separately in some discussion in 2013, but that was initiated by I believe it was Councilmember Jack Schron at that point in time, but it didn't come out of the prior commission.
Okay. And with regard to open primaries, was that presented previously?
That I don't know.
Oh, yes. Oh, thanks, Bill. I believe there's a minority report. It was discussed. Open primaries and nonpartisan elections were both discussed
Okay.
at the last commission, but neither were recommended.
Okay. What does anybody want to say about it? Yeah.
Well, maybe we could look at the other topics, and then if others take priority over that, maybe we just kind of put this one on the back burner if we're prioritizing.
That's for me.
Just to, and maybe go through the other topics, and they may be of more importance, without totally dismissing it at this point, but
Yeah,
see what
I'm good with that. 4, 5, and 6.
Judge,
Yes.
I think these are topics that we should review as a charter commission.
Okay. Moving then to 8, appointed officials, sheriff, elected official. Was that in the last time? Was it?
Yes. Mr. Chair, this was an item that was discussed in the last commission. I believe the recommendation coming out of the last commission was not to go with an elected sheriff, but to have an appointed sheriff who would serve a specific term and couldn't be removed without council approval. So that was the final recommendation, but both having an elected and the final proposal were discussed conceptually.
And just to refresh my memory, appointed and confirmed by the county council?
Yes, and that is currently the sheriff is appointed by the executive and confirmed by council, but the sheriff serves at the pleasure of the county executive, so it can be removed at any time.
So the change would be?
The change would have been to make it a set term and that the sheriff couldn't be removed from office without approval from the council and the county executive. So it would basically create a for cause type of necessity for removal.
I just have one is the removal by majority of council, or the proposed majority, or like or a super majority?
I believe it was the executive still had the power to remove, but would need a majority of council to agree. I don't 100% remember, but I believe that's how it worked.
That is correct. That's how it worked.
Thanks, Davida.
Okay.
You're welcome.
The last time this was presented, was that the first time that it had been presented, or was it presented at the first charter review?
It was presented at the first charter review.
Okay. So it's been looked at twice.
It's been looked at the first charter review, and then it was recommended to council. Council declined to put it on the ballot.
Okay. And then it was presented the second time?
This time around, yeah.
This time around?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Is there any reason that council list any reasons as to why they did not want to put it on the ballot, or they just voted nay?
I think, well, I don't want to speak again for council as an 11-member body, but I believe some of the testimony at that time was about they did not believe that the existing structure was flawed. I believe this recommendation came shortly after Sheriff Reed was removed by the prior county executive without much explanation. There wasn't a cause given in that instance. And there were some questions, including among council members, as to why. But at the end of the day, council just decided for whatever reason not to move forward with this proposal despite those circumstances.
But the one we're considering right now is to have an elected sheriff.
Correct.
So I just want to point that out. So that would go back beyond county charter to the days of an elected sheriff.
Correct.
And that was a very heavy topic at the first Charter Review Commission, and all of the Charter Review Commissions agreed that it should stay appointed position.
Go ahead.
And given the proposal that's before us today, I believe this has been examined, and that an elected, we should not need to consider it this time around.
Does anyone have any strong opinion about moving back towards an elected sheriff? Is there any new information that's come forward that would support moving back towards an elected?
Other than the testimony we had here, and I don't really believe it was strong enough in order to make a change in the way we're doing things today. And I concur.
I concur. That I agree with that testimony that I heard as well.
Okay. So are we in agreement then that we should strike further consideration of topic 8? Okay. Do we need a vote?
I don't know.
Okay. It appears that we've got consensus.
Maybe if we're going to strike a topic, maybe we should vote just so then it's off the table.
Sounds like a good idea. Okay. Call a roll, please.
Honorable Judge Adrian,
Aye.
This is to strike
This is the strike.
item 8.
8.
Okay.
to strike item 8.
Right.
Honorable Judge Adrian,
Aye.
Diane Downing,
Aye.
Honorable Drucker,
Yes, aye.
Dennis Kennedy, Michael King,
Aye.
Honorable Tom Persis,
Aye.
Claire Rizzuto,
Aye.
Victor Ruiz,
Aye.
and Davida Russell.
Aye.
Okay. Topic 8 is stricken from further consideration. Moving to topic 9, as it relates to children of offenders.
Oh, I did read that statement, but can anyone who was here at the last meeting give a little bit more of an explanation of what the children of offenders just because I was reading it, but I just want to make sure I understand it
Sure.
clearly.
To the best of my recollection, the advocate for the children of offenders was actually looking for some programmatic support to assist and service children of offenders who are in the county jail. She, during her testimony, acknowledged that perhaps the charter might not be the most appropriate place to tackle this issue. And in fact, I think Mr. Kennedy did speak to her after the meeting to talk about how, you know, the county's budget process works and how programmatically, you know, we could work with her through the normal budget process. So,
In fairness to the witness making the presentation the last time, she was very passionate, and everything she said I couldn't disagree with. I mean, you know, you have parents who, for whatever reason, are locked up, for lack of a better term, and then we have these kids, and we have to do something with the offspring and the children to make sure that they're functioning adults in today's society. The lady definitely, without a doubt, captured my heart, and I really believe that something needs to be done. But I also concur with the chief financial officer that this should be a budgetary item and should be handled in a normal routine of doing business as the county, and should be a line item in the budget, and certainly not a part of the charter review. I'm sorry.
agreed.
I concur. She was very passionate, but I agree that it's not a place for the charter, in the charter.
If we decide to strike this, is there a process or mechanism by which we can make reference to the fact that this is an appropriate thing for the county as a government to be looking at enhancing, but that it's not a proper thing for the charter, and make a referral?
In the form of a recommendation, I concur, Judge.
Okay. Very good. Then can I get a motion then to strike topic 9?
So moved.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. If there is no unreadiness on the motion, would you call the roll, please?
Well, to strike topic 9, Judge Adrian,
Aye.
Diane Downing,
Aye.
Honorable Susan Drucker,
Aye.
Dennis Kidding's not here, Michael King,
Aye.
Honorable Tom Persick,
Aye.
Aye.
Victor Ruiz, and Davita Russell.
Aye.
9 is stricken. Can I get a motion to make a recommendation? If you can think of a way to perform that.
Motion to make a recommendation to follow through on the testimony given, I can't remember the lady's name, as to how to provide for, as I would refer to them as our children in need.
I'll second that.
Properly moved and seconded. Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor? No, I guess we need to do it by roll call.
We could do a voice vote.
Think a voice vote would be fine. Okay.
Aye.
All those in favor, aye. Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Okay. Topic 10, executive and council succession.
Yes, Mr. Chair. This item was previously presented to the last Charter Review Commission. I believe it was discussed at length. There were a lot of moving parts in this one, given the discussions around how the functioning of county government works based on if the county executive vacates office for whatever reason, the council president automatically becomes the county executive, which creates sort of a disruption in two branches of government at the same time. And there were a lot of policy proposals discussed. I believe what was ultimately recommended had to basically gave the council president the ability to reassume their office on council, their seat on council, once the executive seat was filled. But there are a whole host of different options here in terms of who in potentially the executive's cabinet could succeed the executive, whether you would hold a special election, sort of monetary costs around that. So this is a complex issue, and there was a recommendation made to council. Ultimately, it was not recommended to go onto the ballot, but it was discussed at length at the last Charter Review Commission.
New information since the last time this was taken up?
I'm not aware of any new information other than the proposal that we received at the last commission meeting from Councilman Miller. I know that this is an issue that hasn't yet come up because we haven't had a county executive leave office before the end of his term, but has the potential to create issues down the road. So it's one of those things where it might be worth taking another look just to.
Judge and Michael, I remember asking the county councilman about this. Is there a template in any other county in the state of Ohio that we could use to see as to what other counties or counties similar to ours would do in a situation like that? And obviously we don't have that information here. And I do agree with you, Michael, it is a complex situation. And I do agree with the county councilman that we need to review it. But I think we need far more information than we have today before we can consider it. Because I do agree with you, Michael. I think it's very complex. And what we don't want to do is disrupt the way we operate. I think government, speaking for myself, there's enough disruptions on a day-to-day basis without looking for more. And that's just my opinion. So I think we need far more information before we can make any evaluation on this, and then it's up to the council to voice their opinion.
May I?
Yes.
At the meeting also, I did ask Councilman Miller, did he have any recommendations on and suggestions that he could put before us in writing, because it was a rough topic last time, and the council members still did not put it on the ballot, and he's brought it back again. And so I asked if he could give us some type of format of what he's exactly talking about. Did he present anything else after that town hall meeting?
The document we have in front of us from December the 6th, was that at the town hall, the last meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So
it's nothing else.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Given the nature of this particular beast, it just seems as though it's crying out for further review. So I would think that it's one of the things that we want to spend some time on. At least that would be my suggestion.
And I agree, Judge. And the reason being, it's like, as you know, I'm a banker by profession. Mm-hmm. And, the last thing I ever wanted to do was try a new program out and be the first to do it. And somewhere, somehow, there has got to be a county that has gone through this, and there has to be some type of practice or procedure. I would at least like to exhaust that before making any determination and see where the best practice is in this type of situation.
Yeah, because I don't think that we're limited just to what Summit County has, the only other charter in the state. But I can't imagine that charter is exclusive to Ohio. There've got to be other locations across the country that have taken this up. There's no real point to be served by reinventing the wheel.
All right.
I would suggest that if we are in agreement that this is something worthy of a serious inspection, that we should ask staff to find out what else is out there and bring us that for us to review.
I agree with that.
And also remind Councilman Miller if he has some type of structure in mind that he present that to us as well.
He's present on today's date, and I expect that if we present him the opportunity, he may have something to add when it's time for further comment.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. At this point, again, I think that by consensus, unless I've missed something, that we're all in agreement that topic 10 is one that we want to take a dive into.
Yeah.
Okay. That brings us back to topic 11, which is campaign finance language.
Judge, I got to be careful how I say this, you know. There's the Ohio Revised Code out there, and I certainly don't want to reinvent the wheel on that. I understand the value of the appearance that a group or a individual or a PAC is trying to influence the office. But on the same token, I certainly don't want to put anything out there that already is recited in the code somewhere, and in some court will just come by and invalidate what we do. So I don't have the answer to that, Judge.
I think the thing that's most compelling to me is that, you know, we have limits at the city, state, federal level, but we don't have it at the county level. With the Ohio Revised Code, can you help me understand what that says that limits the county? But
I don't think, and again, this would be up to the lawyers in the room, in our city, for example, there are no limits. And that's all I can say. Now, in federal races, there are limits. I can't speak as to, as far as the election of judges, if there are limits or how, but I think it varies. What about in Solon?
Solon, no, but for judges, there's limits.
Yeah, they definitely limit.
City is by whatever your own city charter.
Yeah, and there are no limits, so that's.
But prior to.
Revised Code, I guess.
I don't know. I don't
Oh,
know.
'cause you
But
said that you
what
don't
I don't
want-
want to do is put something out there and then find out we're in violation of the code. And I don't know the answer to that. The law director or the law department would have to get back to us on that.
But then maybe that's a reason why we should at least look at it.
Exactly,
and
yeah.
then you say, is it conflicting with some?
Right.
That's my point.
Some code.
I
it's
agree.
enough just to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see both sides in this argument. I think it could be some healthy discussion on a topic like this.
I concur, and that's the
Whether we
point I
move
was
it
trying to
forward or
make.
not, but,
But let's make sure we got it right.
right, sure.
Because my recollection is fuzzy, but you know, with all the kinds of things that were going on with regard to corruption when the charter changed, campaign finance, that is money being given to individuals for their campaigns, was, I'm not going to say it was the least of the problems we had, but it wasn't as prominent as a lot of the other kinds of corrupt activity that was taking place. I think that the whole purpose of putting together this charter and having the kind of government that we have now is to make sure that we get to as close to pristine as possible as it relates to, you know, how county government is seen. And I agree. I think that we, at bare minimum, have an obligation to take a look to see whether or not some form of limitation, reasonable limitation on campaign finance is appropriate under all the circumstances here. So if I'm going to vote, I would vote that we include it in the list of things that we're going to take a look at.
I concur.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. That being the case, Again, unless I'm missing something, I think we have consensus on that matter also. Okay. So that kind of brings us back to 1 and 3 on Inspector General amendment. And we had language before that didn't quite pass muster. The question, I guess, is do we think that there's anything that's come up that would cause us not to at least take a look at making the Inspector General a mandatory position in county government as opposed to permissive at bare minimum?
Yeah, I think we agree on that,
Okay.
that we need to take a look at it.
The one we decided to table was the nonpartisan.
Elections,
7.
yeah, 2 and 7.
So we're 1 and 3. 4, 5, 6 is a second look.
Right.
And then 10 and 11.
10 and 11. And struck 9. Struck 8.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at 2 and 7.
Correct.
We're looking, can I make a comment on that?
Of course.
I guess just looking at the 4 topics now we have, the ones we've combined, those look like they can all be very healthy and detailed discussions. If, to me, I'd be comfortable with just those 4 topics. I don't see the nonpartisan elections or open primaries having as much importance, this is strictly my opinion, as these 4 topics. I'd rather give those 4 topics a really healthy and detailed look rather than adding more to the plate. I just don't see that, those topics 2 and 7 comparing with the 4, or really the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 topics that we agreed on, even though they're combined. That's just my opinion.
The nonpartisan primary was brought forward by the League of Women Voters, who brought forward the
Inspector General.
But it's separate issues. Exactly. Right.
I'm just saying, I'm looking here at the League of Women Voters who sponsored the nonpartisan primary. Who sponsored the open?
I believe it was a private citizen. I forget his name.
Any other discussion about those 2 as topics that we want to take up? Is there a motion that we strike them from consideration then?
So move.
I'll second.
Been properly moved and seconded that topics 2 and 7 be stricken from consideration by the commission. Is there any unreadiness on the motion? All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, those items will be stricken from consideration. So that leaves us with 4 areas of inquiry. Okay. And that seems like plenty enough. Okay. So I guess the next order of business is between now and February to give these 4 topics along with our criteria and the other questions that may come to mind. I had a number of questions that I had set forth that had come to mind for me, but to give all of those to staff, particularly the law department, but any other implicated department of the county government, to ask that they provide us with both information and recommendations for our next meeting in February, if that seems like a rational way for us to proceed, and to ask really that they provide it to us as soon as possible so that we can have an opportunity to really get, a chance to chew on it and consider it before we come back together. And that'll give us an idea. And frankly, maybe what we could do, depending on who submits what, is to have them come and make presentations on what they provide to us. If that, again, makes sense to the body. Yes?
I think,
Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I think that's great because then we can read and ask questions of the people preparing the documents. Sorry.
I was just going to ask if we can specify a date, like maybe since the meeting's on February 7th, maybe have all the material by the February 2nd, which is a Friday. That gives us a weekend. Just because with everyone's schedules, 1 or 2 day notice of information, now that we're getting into
Excellent
this,
point.
I'd like to
Yeah,
take my
excellent
time and
point.
read through everything. So if we could set a date that we will receive it by such a date, then we all know, okay, by this date, we're going to receive all the material to give us plenty of time to read through it all.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
Yes.
Davida.
I'm sorry. Are we going to, just to recap, just to make sure I have it written down correctly, we are saying yes to 1 and 3, 4,
Yes.
5, 6,
Yes.
and 10 and 11?
Yes.
Okay. Are we going to concentrate on 1 and 3 at one meeting and 4, 5, 6 at another meeting and 10 and 11 at another meeting? Or are we going to do all of them at each meeting?
I think given the limited amount of time that we have, the last thing that I would like to do before we break today is to try to see if we have some sense amongst ourselves as to what the priority of consideration is, and then to try to do certainly no more than 2, probably given the meat that's in each one of these, no more than 1 of these at each of the subsequent meetings.
Very good.
Okay, if that meets with everybody's approval, because I think that's the way that we get a chance to really be able to focus. And since we have between now and July, if we have to push one back, like a couple of these, I think might actually take a couple of meetings on our behalf. So I think that we can do it, in that way that'll carry us. Yes.
In terms of moving forward on that, I know from the last commission's experience, it will likely be a bit of an iterative process. So one thing we might want to consider is, say we hear a topic of discussion at the next meeting, setting aside a few minutes at the following meeting, if we have a new draft of some proposed charter language to just sort of look at, provide feedback to law or whoever's assisting in drafting that language, and just sort of continue to refine what we're working on. Not revisit the full blown discussion every single time, but yeah.
Well, the other thing that I think The other thing that I think kind of makes sense is for us to talk about, who's going to do this drafting. Because I don't know necessarily that we're going to sit down and, put our heads together and come up with the appropriate language by ourselves. So it might be useful as we're moving forward, since we're asking for recommendations from the departments, to ask them, what kind of language do they see as being appropriate for us to consider? Because I would rather that we spend our time not drafting, but taking a look at drafts and making a determination as to how some of the drafts that come together are mixed and matched. We can cast out the stuff we think is not good and keep the stuff that makes sense.
I agree.
Okay.
All right, so just for Victor's benefit here, as the representative from the law department, I just want to make sure he has deliverables that he owes us. He's got a nice. So in terms of feedback, I'm assuming for instance, we start with the Inspector General, we're going to ask the law department to take a look at what's been submitted, and is it this commission's intention to invite the Inspector General, for instance, to come to the next meeting and be part of that discussion, answer questions of the commission, or what? I'm just trying to figure out what we're looking for from the county department heads, just so we can make sure everybody who has a stake is in the room.
Why would I want to hear from him? Yeah, of course.
Okay.
You know, and you know, that's another thing that I think that in sitting down and talking to staff, we need to try to figure out who's the most appropriate person, both to get this information that we have now for review, and then who's the most appropriate person or persons to come before the commission to make presentation. So hopefully that's a conversation that we can have after the meeting is over.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I'd also like to suggest maybe that we start with the PRC issue. We've got a lot of feedback on it. It's a really complex issue. It's one we've all said is a priority. So, again, just want to make sure that we give it enough time to hopefully really deal with the issue. But as you said, we have to start to think about the prioritization of those 4 areas.
Mm-hmm. Well, since that's the 3 we folded into one, that would seem to make the most sense. So in the grand scheme of things, numbers 4, 5, and 6 will be the item that we take a look at first, unless there is some sentiment to the contrary. Do we have consensus on that?
Yes.
With regard to the remaining ones, executive and council succession, office of the inspector general,
I thought Inspector General we're going to do it. Inspector General we're going to do at the next meeting.
We
just
talked
said
about
4, 5,
PRC.
6.
Switching it.
Switch it, okay, I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
missed
that's
that.
okay.
Mm-hmm. So any sentiment about what we should take up after we take up the PRC?
I think Inspector General to come to some final wording, thoughts, and conclusions.
Okay. You know, and I'm not necessarily in disagreement. I think if we're looking at this from order of magnitude as to what we have to do, that I think that the Inspector General is going to take less time, and that maybe the next one that's going to take a lot of time is really going to be where's my notes? The executive,
It's going to be
executive and council succession. And so I would suggest that be this number 2 item.
It's fine. Yeah.
Yes.
Also, too, maybe, I don't know how other people feel, but I'm kind of, once I'm down here, I'd rather pound out a whole topic. So, and it just seems an hour may be very limiting. So I don't know how everyone else feels about maybe just keeping the ending time open a little bit, just because if we're in the midst of discussion, I hate to cut it out just because we're at the hour. But obviously it's how everyone else feels as well. But I figure once we're here, kind of want to get through an entire topic.
You get no argument from me. You know, I mean, the whole point, you know, like I said, of this is to try to maximize what we can accomplish when we get together. So if we get good information from staff, you know, hopefully we can get what we need to get done within the hour time frame that we've set aside. That having been said, I think that it makes absolutely no sense to put an artificial, you know, stop time on this simply because I hate meetings and anything more than an hour, you know, certain parts of my anatomy start to rebel. So, but
If I may, Judge, make a recommendation, Mrs. Drucker would understand this. If we could start earlier, I'm fine with it, but as I get into evening meetings at the city, I need to be back there. So if we could, and I don't know what your schedule allows, but if we could bump it to 3 o'clock if we know we need more time, that would be my preference. I'm willing to give it as much time as we can, but I know what my responsibilities are back home.
Well, after today, I'm pretty much a free man.
So you think.
At least as of this moment. We'll have to
Yes.
see what happens next. As somebody is prone to
You're
say.
going to find out how busy you're going to be.
You make me shudder.
Maybe we can alternate some of those times as well.
Yeah, well, Davida, I mean, one of the reasons that we set this at the time that we did was recognizing, kind of the strictures that you had on your situation. And I'm wondering whether or not this has worked out with regard to you, and if moving it up an hour has any kind of impact on your situation.
I'll have to work on that. I'll work on that.
The other thing that we could do is, given the fact that we know that this next one is going to be a little bit on the hairy side, why don't we stick with what we've got now and see how this plays out at the next meeting? Okay. If it turns out that, we woefully underestimated the amount of time that's necessary to do what we need to do, then we can set another meeting or meetings in the course of the month. And, all things being equal, although, I think that the best way to conduct business is face-to-face whenever possible, but we might be, we can have at least one face-to-face during the month. If we find that one meeting face-to-face is not sufficient, then maybe we can find times when we don't have to leave our respective, bailiwicks to come down here, and we can do something, electronically, one way or another, whether we're talking about telephone, teleconference, Skype, Telefriend, something. Maybe we can find some alternatives. So if you guys are okay with it, I think I'd leave the next one as it is, and then we'll know what we got to do after we do that. Is that okay?
Good suggestion by me.
Good enough. Okay. So again, going back to priorities, is it the consensus of the group that the next priority after the PRC should be executive and council succession?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Any objection? Okay, then by consensus, the second order priority will be the executive and council session. Okay. Then campaign finance, I think campaign finance language is probably going to take more time. Well, maybe not. Maybe it'll take less time. Then the Inspector General, what do you think?
I would, given the discussion on this issue at the last Charter Review Commission, my guess is that there will be 9 different opinions as to campaign finance.
I agree with that.
So I expect this would probably take more time than the Inspector General, only given the fact that I honestly think the Inspector General question is really, do we do something or don't we?
Yeah.
And then there are maybe some details that we need to iron out, but I think it's going to be a limited set of issues.
Okay. That being the case, then I would suggest that we make campaign finance number 3 in the order of priority. And then that necessarily means that the 4th item that we'll take up will be the Office of Inspector General. And that'll be our 4th and final priority. Let me ask this question because I wasn't really clear, and somebody asked me, and I wasn't really clear as to how this would go. Now that we've settled on 4 priorities, are we locking the door on this? I mean, are we saying that these are the things that this commission is going to review, or is there a possibility for somebody to submit something else? How was it handled previously?
I believe at the last commission there was no formal sort of cutoff or deadline as to when items could be submitted, and I think that somewhat contributed to the haphazard way in which things sort of ended up in getting final proposed language to council. That being said, I mean, if there's something that comes to the attention of this commission that is extraordinarily compelling, that warrants further review, I would be open to considering that, but unless it's something that either we just haven't heard before and, warrants some additional review, or some major circumstances change, I would focus on these 4 issues and then leave that door cracked open.
So we can leave this as a soft close, then? That makes sense?
Sure.
Okay.
A medium closed.
Okay, fine.
A crack. I remember those nights.
Okay. All righty. Well, it looks as though we've established our priorities. Is there any further discussion by the panel? Yes.
Just if we're going to be addressing the, for our next meeting, if we could just make sure Debbie Sotherington and Douglas Dykes, those are the 2 individuals, if they both will be notified so that they can be here if they have questions or input.
Okay. Any other discussion? Anything else that needs to come to our attention before we open it up to the public? Okay. That being the case, we're open for public input.
First, we'll have William Tarter.
Thank you.
Lou. Make sure your mic's on.
All right, now, good evening.
Good evening.
Sorry, originally I was going to say something else, but now I am here to object. Don't get offended, because some of you were not at a previous meeting. The Honorable and Ms. Russell, remember that lady was very passionate, but there's a couple of things are connected. I'm here right now to object the rejection of that bipartisan election. The idea of democracy is you want all the people to come here to share the ideas and to work together for everybody. So now, of course, right now the scope is a county. Charter is the structure of the government, but if you don't have an open invitation to everybody, lots of people automatically feel discouraged because of maybe education, because of their financial status, all kind of reasons. Just like in this meeting, I thought we would have more people coming to the last session, but because of the weather and maybe the time also, and because of the nature of it, you don't have that many people to turn up, which is actually not a good thing. So if we only limited our elections to, you have to declare you're Democrats or you're Republican, some of the people already feel discouraged to begin with. So there will be no way to encourage more people. I mentioned that particular passionate lady because she mentioned lots of people are already in a disadvantage. Like the children she was talking about, their parents were in jail and they have no parents to take care of them. Some of them are in the custody of this, the county, the state to begin with. They don't get a proper education and they don't know where they will grow up to be. and this and that all together. So if we don't encourage people to participate, the government, and there will be no way to really get a good direction for everybody together. Because in that case, there will be more people left behind. Because the reason I have started coming to county meetings is because I already found out different sectors of the people in this county have been neglected already. So if we don't have a bipartisan election to encourage people to participate, we lose lots of opportunities to help one another. And that's really bad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman Miller.
Honorable Judge Adrian and members of the commission, you have chosen to focus on just 4 topics. Compared to the previous commission that recommended 15 amendments and considered more topics than that. Your decision has advantages. It allows you to really take a deep dive and to give very careful consideration and come up with really good language, which I think was an area where the previous commission could have done better. So I think that puts you in a strong position. What I'm going to suggest is that with there being only 4 topics, I don't think they need to be done sequentially. I think your commission would be perfectly capable of working on all 4 issues at the same time. I had early suggested using a committee structure, but it could be more informal than that. You could have one of your members agree to take the lead in each of the 4 topics and have that person pull 2 other members of the commission around them and kind of have some little work groups that could do some of the grunt work and research in each of these topics in between meetings and pull things together. So I just throw that out there for your consideration. And one other thing, I will have more to say about succession at the next meeting. So I'll present some alternatives, hopefully backed up by some information on what's being done in some other places around the country. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take your remarks under consideration, and we look forward to getting what you provide to us. Thank you. That's it. Okay. Unless there's someone else who has some input that they'd like to make, it appears that we are at the conclusion of our agenda, and that being the case, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Probably moved and seconded that we be adjourned. We therefore do stand adjourned.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Same to you.